Marcus Washington pressed his face against the cold glass of his studio apartment window, watching the rain streak down in patterns that reminded him of tears. The eviction notice on his kitchen counter seemed to glow with malevolent intent, its red letters spelling out a future he couldn't bear to imagine. 30 days. That's all he had left in the only home he'd known for 3 years, the cramped but cherished space where he'd written his songs, dreamed his dreams, and slowly watched them crumble like autumn leaves. The irony wasn't lost on him that a man who spent his days creating music for others couldn't afford to keep a roof over his own head. His guitar, a weathered acoustic he'd named Hope, leaned against the wall like a faithful friend, its strings slightly out of tune from the apartment's fluctuating temperature. The heating had been shut off 2 weeks ago, another casualty of his mounting debts. Marcus pulled his threadbare sweater tighter around his shoulders and tried to calculate, for the 100th time that week, how he might scrape together the $1,500 he owed in back rent. His phone buzzed with yet another text from his landlord, Mr. Chen, a man who had shown remarkable patience, until patience became a luxury neither of them could afford. The message was brief but loaded with the weight of finality. "Marcus, I need an answer by Friday. I'm sorry, but I have bills too." Friday was tomorrow. Marcus set the phone face down on the windowsill and closed his eyes, feeling the familiar ache of dreams deferred settling in his chest like a stone. Before we dive deeper into this story, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the channel. That way you'll always stay updated with our upcoming videos and continue discovering more fascinating stories. Now let's begin. The rain continued its relentless drumming against the window as Marcus picked up Hope and began to play, his fingers finding the familiar chords that had brought him comfort through countless dark nights. The melody was melancholy but beautiful, a reflection of his current state of mind. He'd written it during his first year in Los Angeles, when everything seemed possible and the city's lights promised endless opportunities for a young man with talent and determination. Now those same lights felt like distant stars, beautiful but impossibly far away. His studio apartment sat on the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse in downtown LA, in a neighborhood that was caught between gentrification and urban decay. The building housed an eclectic mix of residents, struggling artists, elderly pensioners, young families trying to make ends meet, and the occasional entrepreneur chasing their version of the American dream. It was a microcosm of the city itself, full of hope and heartbreak, existing side by side. Marcus had grown to love the community despite its imperfections, or perhaps because of them. The thought of leaving felt like losing a piece of his identity. As he played, his mind wandered to the series of unfortunate events that had led him to this precipice. The recording studio where he'd worked as a sound engineer had closed suddenly 3 months ago when the owner fled to avoid bankruptcy. His freelance gigs had dried up as the industry tightened its belt, and the part-time job at the coffee shop barely covered groceries, let alone rent. He'd sold everything of value except Hope, including his grandmother's ring, but it hadn't been enough. Pride had prevented him from asking his family back in Detroit for help. They'd already sacrificed so much to support his musical ambitions, working double shifts and taking out loans they couldn't afford. He refused to burden them further with his failures. The music seemed to fill the small space with something approaching peace, a temporary reprieve from the anxiety that had become his constant companion. Through the thin walls, he could hear Mrs. Rodriguez next door humming along to his playing, a sweet elderly woman who always had a kind word and occasionally shared her homemade tamales. Her presence reminded him that even in the darkest moments, there were still threads of light woven into the fabric of everyday life. These small connections had sustained him through his lowest points, proof that human kindness persisted even when everything else seemed to fall apart. Outside, the city continued its relentless pulse, indifferent to individual struggles, yet somehow comforting in its consistency. Sirens wailed in the distance, Mixing with the sounds of traffic and the occasional laughter from the street below, Los Angeles had a way of making people feel simultaneously invisible and scrutinized, anonymous yet exposed. Marcus had learned to find solace in this contradiction, drawing inspiration from the city's complex personality for his songwriting. Even now, facing eviction and an uncertain future, he couldn't imagine creating music anywhere else. The city had wounded him, but it had also shaped him into the artist he'd become. The next morning arrived grey and unforgiving, with fog rolling in from the Pacific, like a blanket of uncertainty. Marcus hadn't slept well, his mind racing through impossible scenarios and last-ditch solutions, until exhaustion finally claimed him around 4 a.m. He woke to the sound of his phone ringing insistently, the harsh electronic tone cutting through the fog of his dreams like a blade. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine it might be good news, perhaps a studio calling with work or a miracle investor interested in his music. Reality crashed back as he saw his sister Carmen's name on the screen. "Marcus, honey, how are you holding up?" Carmen's voice carried the particular blend of love and worry that only siblings could master. She was 3 years older, and had always possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense when he was struggling, even from 2,000 miles away in Detroit. Her timing was both a blessing and a curse. He desperately needed to hear a familiar voice, but he dreaded having to explain just how dire his situation had become. He cleared his throat, trying to inject some energy into his voice. "I'm managing, Carmen. Just going through a rough patch. But you know how it is in this business. Things always work out eventually." The lie tasted bitter on his tongue, but he couldn't bear to worry her further. She had her own family to care for, twins who were starting college next year, and her husband's construction company was struggling with the economic downturn. The last thing she needed was another problem to solve. "Marcus, I can hear it in your voice. You're not okay." Aunt Carmen had always been able to see through his pretenses, a skill honed through years of watching out for her dreamer little brother. "I've been thinking about you a lot lately, and I had this feeling that you needed help. Mom always said I had intuition about these things, and right now it's telling me that you're in trouble. Real trouble." The kindness in her voice nearly broke his resolve. He found himself standing at the crossroads between pride and desperation, the same intersection where so many dreams came to die. Part of him wanted to confess everything, to let her share the burden he'd been carrying alone for months, but the thought of his family sacrificing even more for his failed ambitions felt unbearable. They'd already given up so much to support his move to Los Angeles, working extra hours and postponing their own dreams to fund his pursuit of musical success. "Carmen, I appreciate you checking on me, I really do. But I'm handling things. I've got some promising leads on work, and there might be a recording contract on the horizon." The fictional contract felt real as he spoke it into existence, a manifestation of desperate hope rather than calculated deception. "I just need a little more time for everything to come together." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, filled with the weight of unspoken truths and sibling telepathy. Carmen sighed deeply, a sound that carried 28 years of watching her brother chase impossible dreams with unwavering determination. "Okay, Marcus, but promise me something. If things get too hard, if you need anything at all, you'll call me. Pride is a luxury we can't afford when family is involved. Do you hear me?" After ending the call, Marcus sat on the edge of his unmade bed, staring at the eviction notice that seemed to mock him from across the room. The fictional recording contract he'd mentioned to Carmen felt like a ghost haunting his apartment, a specter of the success that had remained tantalizingly out of reach for years. He'd come close several times, close enough to taste the possibility of making it, only to watch opportunities slip through his fingers like smoke. Each near miss had been a small death, slowly eroding his confidence and bank account in equal measure. The morning sun struggled to penetrate the fog outside his window, creating an ethereal quality to the light that made everything appear dreamlike and uncertain. Marcus picked up hope and began to play softly, letting his fingers find a new melody that seemed to emerge from the complex mixture of emotions swirling in his chest. The music was haunting and beautiful, born from the intersection of despair and determination that had become his permanent address. As he played, he found himself thinking about all the people who had believed in him over the years, from his high school music teacher, who had encouraged him to pursue his dreams, to the coffee shop customers who had dropped dollars in his guitar case during his busking days. Their faith had sustained him through the worst moments, but now even that felt fragile. He wondered if there came a point when believing in someone became a disservice, when encouragement transformed into enablement of impossible dreams. The thought was too painful to pursue, so he let the music carry him away from such philosophical torments. Outside, the city was waking up, millions of people beginning another day of their own struggles and triumphs, each carrying their private hopes and fears like invisible baggage. By afternoon, the fog had lifted to reveal one of those crystalline Los Angeles days that made the city's reputation for beauty seem understated rather than exaggerated. Marcus had spent the morning walking the streets of his neighborhood, partly to escape the suffocating presence of the eviction notice, and partly to clear his head before what he knew would be the most important conversation of his life. Mr. Chen had agreed to meet him at the small cafe on the corner of 3rd and Spring, a neutral territory that felt less threatening than the stark formality of a landlord's office. The Grind was the kind of neighborhood coffee shop that served as an unofficial community center, where locals gathered to work on laptops, conduct informal business meetings, and share the daily gossip that kept the area's social fabric intact. Marcus had spent countless hours here when his apartment felt too small for his dreams, nursing single cups of coffee for hours while he wrote lyrics on napkins and observed the rich tapestry of human behavior that surrounded him. The familiar smell of roasted coffee beans and the gentle murmur of conversation usually provided comfort, but today the atmosphere felt charged with the electricity of impending judgment. Mr. Chen arrived precisely on time, as was his way, carrying himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had immigrated to America with nothing but determination and had built a modest real estate empire through decades of careful work and sacrifice. He was in his late 60s, with silver hair and hands that bore the calluses of someone who had done physical labor before prosperity allowed him to transition into property ownership. Marcus respected him immensely, which made their current situation all the more painful. This wasn't a case of a heartless slumlord squeezing tenants for profit. This was two decent people caught in circumstances neither had created, but both had to navigate. "Marcus, my friend," Mr. Chen said, as he settled into the worn wooden chair across from him, his voice carrying the slight accent that spoke of origins in another culture, and the careful precision of someone who had mastered English as a second language. "You look tired. This situation has been weighing on both of us, I think." The older man's kindness made Marcus's throat constrict with emotion. Throughout the months of missed payments and awkward encounters in the building's hallway, Mr. Chen had maintained his humanity, never making Marcus feel like a failure or a burden. He had extended deadline after deadline, accepting partial payments and IOUs with the patience of someone who understood that dreams sometimes required more time than bank accounts could accommodate. But patience, like every other resource, had its limits. "Mr. Chen, I want you to know how much I appreciate everything you've done for me," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "I know you've given me more chances than any landlord would, and I don't take that lightly. The truth is, I've been struggling to find steady work since the studio closed, and I've exhausted every option I can think of. I'm not giving up, but I also can't keep making promises I'm not sure I can keep." Mr. Chen nodded thoughtfully, stirring his coffee with the deliberate movements of someone who chose his words carefully. "You know, Marcus, when I first came to this country, I was about your age. I had big dreams too, dreams that seemed impossible to everyone around me, including myself some days. I worked 3 jobs, lived in a room smaller than your bathroom, and sent every spare dollar back to my family in Taiwan. There were times I wanted to give up, to go back home and accept a safer, smaller life. The old man paused, his eyes distant with memory. What kept me going was the understanding that struggle is not failure. Struggle is the price we pay for the possibility of something better. But there comes a moment in every person's journey when they must decide whether to continue paying that price or choose a different path. Neither choice is wrong, but both require courage. Marcus felt the wisdom in those words settling into his bones like medicine. Here was a man who had faced his own crossroads and emerged not just successful but compassionate, someone who understood the weight of dreams deferred without becoming bitter about the sacrifices required to pursue them. The realization that he was not alone in his struggle, that countless others had walked this same difficult path, provided a strange comfort even in the face of his immediate crisis. Around them, the cafe continued its daily rhythm, laptops clicking, coffee machines hissing, conversations rising and falling like waves. A young woman at the next table was sketching in a worn notebook, her brow furrowed in concentration as she worked on what appeared to be character designs for a graphic novel. An elderly man near the window was teaching his grandson chess, patiently explaining strategy with the gentle authority of someone passing on accumulated knowledge. These small scenes of human endeavor and connection reminded Marcus that life continued its forward momentum regardless of individual setbacks, and that perhaps there was beauty in being part of that larger story, even when his own chapter felt incomplete. The conversation with Mr. Chen had ended with a bittersweet compromise that felt both like salvation and surrender. The kind landlord had agreed to give Marcus 2 additional weeks to find the money, but they both understood it was more of a compassionate gesture than a realistic solution. As Marcus walked back to his apartment, the weight of those 14 days pressed against his shoulders like a physical burden. 2 weeks to perform a miracle, to find $1,500 in a city that had already taken everything he had to give. The afternoon had grown warm, and the streets were filled with the particular energy of Los Angeles in late autumn, when the oppressive heat of summer had finally broken, but the cool rains of winter hadn't yet arrived. Street vendors called out in Spanish and English, their carts filled with colorful fruits and handmade jewelry. A busker played saxophone on the corner, his case open hopefully for donations from passing pedestrians. Marcus paused to listen, recognizing in the man's soulful melody an echo of his own artistic journey. He dropped his last $5 bill into the case, knowing it was money he couldn't spare, but unable to walk past a fellow musician without offering support. The busker looked up and smiled, nodding his thanks before launching into an improvised riff that seemed to capture the complex emotions of the moment. Music had always been Marcus's universal language, a way of communicating truths that words couldn't adequately express. Even now, facing the possible end of his Los Angeles dreams, he found himself moved by the beauty of that spontaneous performance. It reminded him why he had come to this city in the first place, drawn by the promise that talent and persistence might be enough to transform a young man from Detroit into something approaching his highest aspirations. Back in his apartment, Marcus surveyed his belongings with the calculating eye of someone preparing for either battle or retreat. His possessions had already been pared down to essentials through previous financial crises. The furniture had come with the apartment, so he wouldn't lose much when he left. His clothes fit in 2 suitcases, his books in a single box. The kitchen contained the minimum required for survival: a few plates, basic utensils, and a coffee maker that had become as essential as oxygen. Only hope truly mattered, and she would come with him wherever the road led next. The evening news played on his ancient television, a catalogue of the world's troubles delivered with the professional detachment that characterized modern journalism. Wars in distant countries, political scandals, economic uncertainty, natural disasters. The litany of human struggle put his own problems into perspective without diminishing their immediate impact on his life. He turned off the television and settled at his small table with a yellow legal pad, determined to make a comprehensive list of every possible solution, no matter how unlikely or desperate. The list grew slowly. Selling hope immediately crossed out, calling his family for help also crossed out, applying for emergency assistance programs worth investigating, reaching out to former colleagues, already exhausted, taking on debt, already maxed out, finding a roommate, too little time, moving to a cheaper city, where, getting a cash advance, from what? Each option seemed to lead to another dead end, a maze of impossibilities that reflected the larger economic realities facing millions of Americans. He wasn't unique in his struggles. He was simply one more person caught in the grinding gears of a system that demanded constant productivity and offered little forgiveness for setbacks. As darkness fell over the city, Marcus found himself at his window again, watching the lights come alive across the urban landscape. Somewhere out there, in offices and studios and concert halls, the music industry continued its relentless creation of culture and commerce. Artists were recording songs that would become the soundtrack to other people's lives. Producers were shaping sounds that would define generations. Executives were making decisions that would launch careers or end them with casual indifference. He had wanted to be part of that world so desperately that he had sacrificed everything comfortable and safe in pursuit of the possibility. Now, with failure looming like a thundercloud, he wondered if the dream had been worth the cost. But even as doubt crept in, he found his fingers unconsciously tapping out rhythms against the glass. Music lived in his bones, coursed through his veins like blood. It wasn't something he could abandon even if he wanted to. It was woven into the fabric of who he was. Perhaps that was both his greatest strength and his most dangerous weakness. Some dreams, he realized, were too essential to survive their own death. They either flourished or they destroyed the dreamer in their final gasps. He was about to discover which category his musical aspirations belonged to. The 13th day of Marcus's reprieve arrived with unseasonable warmth and a clarity of light that made Los Angeles look like a movie version of itself. He had spent the past 12 days in a frenzy of activity, following every lead, making every phone call, pursuing every possibility his desperate mind could conjure. Applications had been submitted, favors had been called in, pride had been swallowed in increasingly large doses. The results had been uniformly disappointing. Close calls and near misses that served only to highlight how thoroughly he had exhausted his options over the previous months of struggle. His phone had become an instrument of torture, each ring potentially carrying news of salvation or confirmation of defeat. Most calls went unanswered. Those that didn't brought polite rejections or requests for patience he didn't have. The music industry, he had learned, operated on timelines that bore no relationship to rent deadlines or human urgency. Opportunities that seemed promising on Monday became distant possibilities by Wednesday, and forgotten dreams by Friday. The pace of his desperation was inversely proportional to the speed at which his professional world moved. Marcus had taken to walking the streets of downtown Los Angeles with obsessive regularity, partly to escape the oppressive atmosphere of his apartment, but mostly because movement felt like action, and action felt preferable to the helpless paralysis of waiting. His routes had become ritualistic, following the same patterns through the same neighborhoods, as if familiarity with the city's geography might somehow yield insights into how to remain part of its landscape. He knew every crack in the sidewalk, every mural on the walls, every homeless encampment that spoke to the precarious nature of urban survival. On this particular morning, his wanderings had taken him further afield than usual, beyond the boundaries of his immediate neighborhood, and into the more upscale areas where successful people conducted the business of being successful. The contrast was stark and painful, Gleaming office buildings, expensive cars, clothing that spoke of financial security and professional accomplishment. He didn't belong in this world, had never truly belonged, despite his years of trying to earn entry through talent and persistence. The realization stung, but also carried a strange relief, as if accepting his outsider status might free him from the exhausting pretense of fitting in. The coffee shop he chose for his morning refuge was several notches above his usual haunts, the kind of place where lattes cost as much as he typically budgeted for lunch. But today felt like a day for small rebellions against financial reality, and he ordered an expensive drink with the reckless abandonment of someone who had already lost everything that mattered. The barista was young and fashionably dressed, probably an aspiring actor or model, another dreamer serving coffee while waiting for their real life to begin. Los Angeles was full of such people, beautiful and talented individuals whose stories would mostly end in compromise and redefinition of success. As he settled at a corner table with his overpriced latte, Marcus opened his laptop and began composing what he knew would be his final attempt at professional correspondence. He had decided to reach out to every music industry contact he had ever met, no matter how tenuous the connection, with a message that was part job application, part confession, and part goodbye letter. The words came slowly, each sentence a small defeat wrapped in professional courtesy. He wrote about his situation with as much dignity as he could muster, acknowledging his desperation while trying to maintain some vestige of the confidence that had carried him this far. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was composing his surrender in a coffee shop full of people who probably faced similar struggles behind their carefully maintained facades of success. The man at the next table was having an animated phone conversation about a game-changing opportunity that sounded suspiciously like every other game-changing opportunity that failed to materialize in this city of perpetual potential. The woman near the window was typing furiously on her laptop, pausing occasionally to stare into space with the particular expression of someone wrestling with creative block or existential doubt. They were all part of the same ecosystem of hope and disappointment, each convinced their story would be different, special, worthy of the fairy tale ending that statistics suggested was reserved for a very few. It was during his third hour at the upscale coffee shop, as Marcus stared at his laptop screen trying to find words that might resurrect his dying career, that the impossible walked through the door. At first, he didn't trust his eyes. The figure was partially obscured by oversized sunglasses and a casual but obviously expensive ensemble that seemed designed to deflect attention rather than attract it. But there was something unmistakable about the way she moved, a presence that commanded space without demanding it, a gravitational force that subtly altered the energy of the entire room. Beyoncé Knowles Carter stood at the counter, ordering what appeared to be a simple coffee, her voice low and melodious even in casual conversation with the starstruck barista. Marcus felt his heart begin to pound, with the particular rhythm of disbelief, the same arrhythmic pattern that had accompanied every other surreal moment of his Los Angeles experience. But this was different, more impossible than anything that had come before. The queen of popular music, the woman whose songs had provided the soundtrack to his own creative awakening, was standing 15 feet away from him in a coffee shop where he was composing his artistic obituary. The rational part of his mind immediately began constructing explanations. This was Los Angeles, after all, where celebrity sightings were part of the urban landscape. Famous people needed coffee just like everyone else, and they occasionally ventured into public spaces despite the complications their presence created. But the timing felt loaded with significance, as if the universe had decided to offer him either the cruelest joke or the most extraordinary opportunity of his life. He watched in fascination as she navigated the careful choreography of being recognizable, but seeking normalcy, gracious to the staff, but clearly hoping to maintain some semblance of privacy. Other patrons had begun to notice, their conversations dropping to whispers as recognition dawned. Phones appeared with the stealth and speed that characterized the modern phenomenon of celebrity encounters. Marcus felt a protective instinct rise in his chest, an irrational desire to shield her from the invasion that was about to commence. Perhaps it was his years of being on the other side of the music industry, understanding the burden that came with public visibility, or perhaps it was simply human decency, recognizing another human being's desire for a quiet moment in a chaotic world. As Beyoncé collected her order and turned to scan the room for an empty table, her gaze briefly met Marcus's. In that split second of connection, he saw something that surprised him. Not the calculated warmth of a public figure managing her image, but genuine weariness, the same exhaustion he had been carrying in his own eyes for months. Fame, he realized, came with its own form of struggle, its own version of the weight that pressed down on anyone trying to maintain their authentic self in a world that demanded constant performance. She chose a table near the back corner of the cafe, as far from the growing cluster of whispered conversations and surreptitious photography as the space allowed. Marcus watched as she settled in with her coffee and what appeared to be a notebook, the same kind of worn journal that every songwriter he knew carried like a lifeline. She was working, he realized, probably stealing moments of creative time in the anonymous sanctuary of public spaces, finding inspiration in the same urban energy that had drawn him to Los Angeles years ago. The parallels were too profound to ignore, even as the circumstances of their respective situations couldn't have been more different. The cafe's atmosphere had shifted dramatically, excitement and tension filling the air like electricity before a storm. Other customers were torn between the desire to approach and the recognition that interrupting her privacy would be fundamentally wrong. Staff members moved with exaggerated casualness, trying to appear normal while clearly thrilled by the presence of someone whose music had sold hundreds of millions of copies worldwide. Marcus found himself caught in the same dilemma, paralyzed by the proximity to greatness and the awareness that this moment would never come again in his lifetime. Then something extraordinary happened. A small commotion near the front of the cafe drew everyone's attention as a young man with a camera pushed through the door, clearly having been alerted to Beyoncé's presence by social media. His intention was obvious and aggressive, the kind of paparazzi intrusion that transformed public spaces into hunting grounds. Without conscious thought, Marcus stood up from his table and positioned himself between the photographer and Beyoncé's corner, not confrontationally but definitively, creating a human barrier that would require the intruder to go through him to reach his target. The moment stretched like a held breath as Marcus stood between the photographer and his intended target, his body language calm but unmistakably protective. The young man with the camera hesitated, clearly calculating whether the potential photographs were worth the complication of dealing with an unexpected obstacle. Around them, the cafe's other patrons watched with the fascination of people witnessing something they had never seen before and might never see again. Time seemed to slow, each second weighted with the potential for transformation or disaster. "Excuse me," the photographer said, his voice carrying the aggressive politeness of someone accustomed to bulldozing through human obstacles in pursuit of valuable images. "I just need to get past you for a second." Marcus didn't move. Instead, he spoke in a voice that was quiet but carried clearly through the suddenly silent cafe. "She's just trying to have her coffee in peace, man. We've all got jobs to do, but maybe today we let her have a normal moment like the rest of us." There was no anger in his words, no confrontation, just a simple statement of principle that hung in the air between them. The photographer's eyes darted between Marcus and his target, clearly frustrated by the unexpected resistance. In the background, Marcus could sense rather than see Beyoncé observing the interaction, though he didn't turn around to look. This wasn't about getting her attention or earning her gratitude. It was about doing what felt right in a moment when right and wrong were clearly delineated. The same moral clarity that had compelled him to give his last $5 to the street musician was now guiding him to protect a stranger's privacy, regardless of her fame or his own desperate circumstances. "Look, I understand you're trying to be a good guy," the photographer continued, his voice taking on the wheedling tone of someone attempting manipulation. "But this is my job. I need these photos. You don't know what it's like trying to make a living in this city." The irony of that statement wasn't lost on Marcus. Here he was, less than 24 hours away from losing his home, being lectured about the difficulties of making a living in Los Angeles by someone whose job involved invading other people's privacy. The absurdity almost made him laugh, but the seriousness of the moment kept his expression neutral. He could feel the entire cafe watching, waiting to see how this strange standoff would resolve. "I know exactly what it's like," Marcus replied simply, "but knowing how hard it is doesn't change what's right." Something in his tone must have conveyed the depth of his own struggles, because the photographer's aggressive posture began to soften slightly. The young man looked around the cafe, perhaps for the first time noticing that every face was turned toward him, with expressions ranging from disapproval to outright hostility. The crowd's sentiment was clear, and even the most determined paparazzi recognized when the odds were stacked against them. After another moment of hesitation, he lowered his camera and stepped back toward the door. "Whatever, man. Not worth the hassle." The photographer's retreat was graceless but complete, muttering complaints about missed opportunities and difficult subjects as he disappeared back onto the street. As the door closed behind him, the tension in the cafe released like air from a balloon, conversations resuming in hushed tones that gradually returned to normal volume. Marcus turned around slowly, finally allowing himself to look directly at the woman whose privacy he had just defended. Beyoncé had removed her sunglasses, and her eyes held an expression of gratitude mixed with something deeper, recognition, perhaps, of the kind of character that would motivate a stranger to take a stand without expecting anything in return. She gestured toward the empty chair at her table with a slight nod, an invitation that felt both casual and momentous. As he approached her table, Marcus was struck by how different she seemed from her public persona. Without the staging and production that surrounded her performances, she appeared younger somehow, more vulnerable, unmistakably human, despite the aura of accomplishment that surrounded her. Her notebook was open on the table, and he caught a glimpse of handwritten lyrics in the same kind of careful script that filled his own journals. The similarity was both comforting and surreal, a reminder that beneath the vast differences in their circumstances, they shared the fundamental experience of being people who tried to transform feelings into music. "Thank you," she said simply, as he settled into the chair across from her. "That was really kind of you. Most people wouldn't have done that." Marcus shook his head slightly. "Most people would have. They just don't always get the chance to show it." He paused, still processing the unreality of the situation. "I'm Marcus, by the way, and I should probably mention that I'm a huge fan of your work before I say anything else that might accidentally be insulting." For the first time since she had entered the cafe, Beyoncé smiled. Not the practiced smile of public appearances, but something genuine and warm that transformed her face completely. "Nice to meet you, Marcus. And don't worry about being insulting. After 15 years in this business, I've heard everything at least twice." What followed was perhaps the most extraordinary hour of Marcus's life, a conversation that meandered through topics both profound and mundane, with the easy intimacy of old friends reconnecting after years apart. They talked about music, naturally, but also about the peculiar challenges of being creative in a city that commodified creativity, the loneliness that accompanied artistic ambition, and the constant tension between staying true to one's vision and surviving in an industry that demanded compromise. Beyoncé, he discovered, possessed not just the talent that had made her famous, but a genuine curiosity about other people's stories, and an emotional intelligence that made her an extraordinary listener. She asked about his music, his background, his dreams with the kind of attention that made him feel heard in a way he hadn't experienced in months. When he mentioned his current housing situation, carefully and without self-pity, she listened without offering immediate solutions or empty reassurances, understanding intuitively that what he needed most was simply to be seen and acknowledged. "You know what I find interesting about this city," she said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "Everyone comes here thinking they're going to be discovered, like there's some magical moment when the right person hears you and everything changes. But the real magic happens in moments like this, when people recognize something in each other that has nothing to do with fame or money or success. It's about character, about who you are when nobody's watching." Marcus felt the truth of those words settle into his chest like medicine. For years he had been so focused on being discovered that he had lost sight of the discoveries available in everyday human connection. The man who had stood up to protect a stranger's privacy wasn't thinking about career advancement or networking opportunities. He was simply responding from his core values, the same values that had guided him to give his last $5 to a street musician and to refuse his family's financial sacrifice. As their conversation continued, Marcus found himself sharing details about his music that he rarely discussed with anyone, the personal experiences and emotional landscapes that informed his songwriting. Beyoncé listened with the intensity of someone who understood that music was more than entertainment. It was a form of communication that could bridge the gaps between different lives and experiences. When he mentioned that he had written a song about his current struggles, she asked if he would be willing to play it for her. The request felt both thrilling and terrifying. Here was arguably the most successful musical artist of her generation, asking to hear his work in a coffee shop that had become the unlikely venue for the most important audition of his life. Marcus retrieved hope from where she had been waiting by his original table, and the other patrons seemed to sense that something significant was happening. Conversations quieted as he tuned the guitar, the familiar ritual providing a moment of calm before what felt like a leap off a cliff. The song he chose was the one he had been working on that morning, a piece born from his recent struggles, but infused with the resilience that had carried him this far. His voice, roughened by months of stress but still capable of conveying deep emotion, filled the small space with lyrics that spoke of hope deferred but not destroyed, of dreams that bent but refused to break. The melody was haunting and beautiful, a perfect marriage of technique and feeling that demonstrated exactly why he had believed in his musical abilities, despite all evidence to the contrary. When the last note faded, the cafe was completely silent. Beyoncé's eyes were bright with unshed tears, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested she understood exactly what she had just heard. "That's not just a song, Marcus. That's your truth, and it's beautiful. The world needs to hear music like that, honest, real, unfiltered by industry expectations." She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, but instead of taking a selfie or checking messages, she opened her contacts and began scrolling. "I'm going to give you the number of someone very important to me, someone who appreciates authentic artistry the way you just demonstrated. Her name is Sarah Chen, and she runs an independent label that specializes in discovering exactly the kind of talent you represent." Marcus felt his hands begin to tremble slightly as the magnitude of what was happening began to sink in. This wasn't just a chance encounter anymore. It was becoming something that could genuinely change the trajectory of his life. The irony wasn't lost on him that his moment of highest desperation had collided with an opportunity that seemed to emerge from pure serendipity, or perhaps from the cosmic justice that rewarded people who remained true to their values even when everything else was falling apart. "But more than that," Beyoncé continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone who had made an important decision, "I want to do something immediate for you. I know what it's like to struggle. Even though my struggles were different from yours, Success doesn't erase the memory of uncertainty, and it doesn't eliminate the responsibility to help others when you have the power to do so. She pulled out her checkbook, an almost anachronistic sight in an age of digital transactions, and began writing with the deliberate motions of someone performing a significant act. The amount she filled in made Marcus's eyes widen in disbelief. $3,000, twice what he owed in back rent and enough to provide a genuine fresh start rather than just a temporary reprieve. "I can't accept this," Marcus said instinctively, even as part of him desperately wanted to reach for the lifeline she was offering. "You don't even know me. This is too much, too generous. I didn't help you earlier because I wanted anything in return." Beyoncé smiled as she tore the check from the book and placed it on the table between them. "I know you didn't. That's exactly why I know you're the right person to receive this help. Marcus, I've been in this industry long enough to recognize authenticity when I see it, and I've been successful enough to understand that true wealth comes from being able to lift others up when they need it most. This isn't charity. It's investment in the kind of person who makes the world better." The check lay on the table like a bridge between his current reality and a future that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. Around them, the cafe continued its daily rhythm, but Marcus felt as though he existed in a bubble of suspended time where miracles were not just possible, but actively occurring. The woman sitting across from him had transformed from an impossible fantasy into a real person offering real help, and the gesture felt both enormous and completely natural. "There's one condition," she added with a slight smile. "I want you to promise me that when you achieve the success I know is coming for you, you'll remember this moment. Remember what it felt like to be helped when you needed it most, and find ways to pass that forward to other artists who are struggling the way you were today. The music industry can be brutal, but it can also be a community of people who support each other through the difficult times." Marcus nodded, unable to trust his voice to convey the depth of his gratitude. The check represented more than financial salvation. It was validation of everything he had believed about the power of human kindness and the possibility that good things could happen to people who maintained their integrity in difficult circumstances. For months he had been operating on faith that his struggles had meaning and purpose. Now, sitting across from one of the most successful artists in the world, that faith was being rewarded in ways he could never have imagined. As they prepared to leave the cafe, Beyoncé gathered her things with the practiced efficiency of someone whose time was precious, but who had chosen to spend it meaningfully. She stood and extended her hand, but instead of a formal handshake, she pulled Marcus into a brief, warm hug that felt like a benediction. "Keep making music that matters, Marcus. The world needs your voice." Outside, the afternoon light had taken on the golden quality that made Los Angeles famous, casting everything in a warm glow that seemed to promise better days ahead. Marcus watched as Beyoncé disappeared into a waiting car, returning to the rarefied world of international stardom, while he remained on the sidewalk, clutching a check that represented the difference between surrender and perseverance. That evening, as he sat in his apartment with hope in his lap and the eviction notice torn into small pieces in the wastebasket, Marcus began writing a new song. This one was about unexpected angels, about the way help sometimes arrived from the most impossible sources, and about the responsibility that came with being saved. The melody came easily, flowing from his fingers with the fluid grace of music that knew exactly what it wanted to say. The call to Sarah Chen could wait until tomorrow. Tonight was for gratitude, for processing the extraordinary day that had shifted his entire life trajectory, and for creating music that honored both his struggles and his salvation. Outside his window, the city of Los Angeles sparkled with renewed promise, no longer a place of broken dreams, but a landscape of infinite possibility where kindness could emerge from the most unexpected encounters. 2 weeks later, Marcus signed his first recording contract with Sarah Chen's label. A year after that, His debut album reached the top of the indie charts. 5 years later, when he established his own foundation to help struggling artists pay their rent and pursue their dreams, he named it Hope, after his guitar, but more importantly, after the quality that had sustained him through his darkest period and led him to a coffee shop where miracles disguised as ordinary kindness waited to change everything. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If you enjoyed this story and appreciate this kind of content, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss upcoming videos and more fascinating stories. Until next time.